The story of the Nakajima G5 in Shenzhen does not begin in a Japanese design bureau, but in the optimistic boardrooms of 1930s America. In 1935, commercial aviation was undergoing a frantic metamorphosis. The Douglas DC-3 had just revolutionized the industry, making air travel profitable and reliable. Yet, even before the DC-3 had fully conquered the skies, the visionaries of the era were dreaming of something far more ambitious. William Patterson, the president of United Airlines, approached Donald Douglas with a proposal that seemed like science fiction. He wanted a super airliner. This aircraft would be a four-engine colossus, capable of crossing the American continent in a single hop without refueling. It would feature pressurized cabins to fly above the weather, air conditioning for luxury, and enough space for 42 passengers to dine and sleep in comfort. It was to be the absolute pinnacle of human engineering. The engineering challenge was so immense that Douglas refused to shoulder the risk alone. He formed a consortium with the Big Five airlines, United, American, Eastern, Pan Am, and TWA, each contributing $100,000 to a development fund. Led by the legendary Arthur Raymond, the Douglas team embarked on a 2-year journey of unprecedented complexity. They produced over 8,100 technical drawings and spent 1,100 hours in wind tunnels testing a model with 866 separate variations. The result was the Douglas DC-4E, the E standing for experimental. It was a marvel of innovation, featuring the first-ever tricycle landing gear on a large aircraft, which allowed the plane to sit level on the ground, and a distinctive triple-tail configuration designed to keep the aircraft's height low enough to fit into existing airport hangars. However, when the prototype finally took flight on June 7, 1938, piloted by the veteran Carl Cover, the reality of the machine began to clash with the dream. The DC-4E was a white elephant. It was too complex, too heavy, and far too expensive to maintain. The weight had ballooned during development to 65,000 pounds, leaving its Pratt & Whitney engines struggling to provide adequate climb performance. The very airlines that had funded it now looked at the operational costs and realized it would be a financial disaster. One by one, they withdrew. Pan Am and TWA turned to the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, which was smaller but actually worked. Douglas was left with a $3 million failure sitting on the tarmac, a masterpiece of technology that no one wanted to buy. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was watching. Japan's aviation industry was excellent at building agile fighters like the Zero, but they lacked the institutional knowledge to build a heavy, four-engine strategic bomber. They needed a shortcut. In late 1939, a front company called Mitsui Trading approached Douglas with an offer: $950,000 for the rejected DC-4E prototype, ostensibly for Japan Airlines. Douglas, desperate to recoup their losses and unaware of the military intent, agreed. The aircraft was dismantled, crated, and shipped to Japan along with every blueprint, wind tunnel report, and maintenance manual Douglas possessed. To hide the plane's true destination, the Nakajima test facility, the Japanese government fabricated a story that the aircraft had crashed into Tokyo Bay shortly after arrival. In reality, it was being meticulously stripped to its last rivet by Japanese engineers. The Japanese goal was to perfect the American design. They kept the advanced wing and the revolutionary landing gear, but redesigned the fuselage to hold a massive bomb bay and defensive turrets. They renamed it the G5 in Shenzhen. To power this beast, they installed their most ambitious engines, the 14-cylinder Memori. On paper, these engines were more powerful than the American originals, and the Japanese Navy believed they had finally achieved the status of a world-class air power. But as the first G5N rolled out in April 1941, the fundamental flaw of reverse engineering became clear. Nakajima's engineers understood what the parts were, but they didn't understand why Douglas had made specific compromises. They had inherited the DC-4ES weight problems and exacerbated them with unreliable, overheating Japanese engines. By the time the G5N took its maiden flight, The dream was already crumbling. The pilot reported a plane that felt heavy and sluggish, much like its American predecessor, but with the added danger of engines that vibrated violently and failed at crucial moments. The Deep Mountain was too slow to outrun fighters and too underpowered to carry a significant bomb load over the required distance. It was a strategic bomber that couldn't reach its targets. While Douglas learned from the DC-4ES failure and went on to create the legendary C-54 Skymaster, the backbone of the Allied victory, Japan had doubled down on the failure, wasting years of resources on a plane that would never drop a single bomb in combat. As 1941 progressed, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a grim reality. Their million-dollar gamble was a liability. The G5N-1 Shinzen prototypes were failing every performance metric. The Mamori engines, despite their theoretical 1,870 horsepower, were mechanical nightmares. They overheated during even modest climbs, and the excessive vibration threatened to shake the massive airframes apart. In a desperate attempt to salvage the project, Nakajima engineers performed a heart transplant on the later prototypes, installing the Mitsubishi Kase engines. While the Kase was legendary for its reliability in the twin-engine Betty bomber, it produced significantly less power. This trade-off made the aircraft safer to fly, but effectively ended its career as a bomber. The G5N was now a massive, four-engine bird of prey that lacked the strength to lift its own claws. By 1942, with the Pacific War in full swing, the Navy officially canceled the G5N bomber program. However, they could not afford to let such large airframes go to waste. For the 6 prototypes were stripped of their dorsal turrets, bomb bays, and defensive cannons. Redesignated as the G5N2L Shinzen Kai, they were relegated to the role of long-range military transports. Assigned to the 1021st Kokai, these glorified freight haulers began a monotonous life of flying spare parts, medical supplies, and high-ranking officers between Tokyo, Formosa, and the distant islands of the Marianas. The aircraft that was designed to incinerate American cities was now spending its days carrying boxes of bandages and engine gaskets across the ocean it was once meant to conquer. While the Japanese struggled with their copy, the Americans were busy perfecting the original. Douglas Aircraft had taken the white elephant lessons of the DC-4E and applied them to a completely new design, the C-54 Skymaster. By stripping away the complexity of the triple tail and the experimental systems, Douglas created a masterpiece of utility. The C-54 became the literal backbone of the Allied global logistics network. It flew the hump over the Himalayas, carried President Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference, and eventually saved the city of Berlin during the 1948 airlift. The difference was stark. Douglas understood the reasons for their initial failure and used that knowledge to build a legend. Japan had merely inherited the failure without the context to fix it. Deep in the Allied intelligence bureaus, the G5N was creating a different kind of ghost. Aerial reconnaissance began spotting these massive four-engine silhouettes at Japanese airfields. Unaware that the program had already been deemed a failure, Allied analysts were terrified. They assigned it the codename Liz, following the convention of giving bombers female names. For years, American commanders prepared for a strategic bombing threat that didn't exist. They drew up contingency plans for Liz attacks on Australian ports and Pacific bases, not realizing that the terrifying bombers they saw in the photos were actually just struggling transports, often grounded by engine trouble. The G5N had managed to achieve one military objective. It had successfully bluffed the most powerful military in the world, simply by existing. As the war entered its final, violent phase in 1945, the fate of the Deep Mountain mirrored the fate of the Empire. One by one, the G5N transports disappeared from the skies. Some were destroyed in the firebombing of Japanese airfields. Others were cannibalized for spare parts as the Japanese industrial base crumbled under the weight of Allied blockade. By the time of the surrender in August 1945, not a single complete G5N remained. The Douglas DC-4E prototype, the American machine that started it all, had been reduced to scrap metal long before, its secrets fully extracted and its usefulness exhausted. All that remained were a few grainy photographs and the technical documents discovered by Allied investigators during the occupation of Japan. The story of the DC-4E and the G5N serves as a timeless cautionary tale for the age of technology. It proves that the physical artifact, the blueprints, the rivets, the engines, is only a fraction of what makes a technology successful. The true power lies in the institutional memory of the designers. The thousands of failed experiments, the rejected ideas, and the hard-won wisdom that tells an engineer why a wing shouldn't be a certain shape. Japan bought the hardware, but they couldn't buy the experience. Douglas, by failing publicly and painfully in 1938, gained the wisdom to dominate the skies for the next 20 years. In the end, the Deep Mountain was not a monument to Japanese power, but a 60,000-pound reminder that in the world of engineering, there are no shortcuts to understanding. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific in 1945, Allied investigators from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit began a scavenger hunt through the ruins of Japan's aviation industry. They were looking for the Liz. For years, she had been a phantom in reconnaissance photos, a four-engine threat that never quite materialized. What they found in the scorched hangars of Nakajima and the redacted naval archives was a story of engineering hubris that bordered on the tragic. The documents revealed that the G5N had been dead in the water long before the first B-29 ever appeared over Tokyo. The investigators discovered that the Japanese had meticulously copied the DC-4ES most advanced features, such as its complex electrical bus and its innovative flush riveting. But they had fundamentally failed to grasp the relationship between wing loading and engine reliability. The investigation highlighted a profound irony. The very secrets Japan had spent nearly $1 million to steal were the same flaws Douglas had been desperate to get rid of. While Japanese engineers were struggling to make the DC-4ES overweight frame fly, Douglas was busy in Santa Monica laughing at their own past mistakes. They had realized that the E in DC-4E stood for an expensive lesson. By the time the U.S. military commissioned the C-54, Douglas had moved toward a philosophy of elegant simplicity, a concept the Japanese reverse engineering team couldn't see because they were too busy measuring the diameter of American bolts. The Allied report concluded that the G5N program had actually hindered Japan's war effort by draining top-tier engineering talent and scarce aluminum away from more viable projects like the P-1Y Jinga. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the man who had first lifted the DC-4E into the sky met a fate as somber as the aircraft he tested. Colonel Carl Cover, the pilot who had carried the legacy of the Wright brothers into the four-engine era, did not survive to see the final surrender. In November 1944, while overseeing the production of the B-29 Superfortress, the very bomber Japan had hoped the G5N would rival, Cover's aircraft disappeared into a blinding snowstorm near Dayton, Ohio. He died just miles away from where he had once flown Orville Wright. His death marked the end of an era. Cover had piloted the birth of the DC-1, DC-2, and DC-3. He had been the hands on the yoke when commercial aviation learned to walk. While his Deep Mountain counterpart in Japan faded into obscurity, Cover's legacy lived on in every C-54 that landed in occupied Tokyo. The final legacy of the G5 in Shenzhen isn't found in a museum because not a single rivet survived the scrapper's torch. Its legacy is found in the textbooks of industrial espionage. It stands as the ultimate proof that technology is not a physical object, but a process of thought. You can steal a blueprint, but you cannot steal the 5 years of failure that made that blueprint possible. The Deep Mountain remained a valley because the Japanese tried to start at the summit. Douglas, on the other hand, climbed from the bottom, through the wreckage of the DC-4E, to eventually reach the top with the DC-6 and DC-7. As we look back at the grainy photos of the Liz sitting lonely on a Japanese tarmac, we see more than just a failed bomber. We see a cautionary tale about the limits of imitation. The DC-4, it was a failure that birthed a revolution in America, while in Japan, it was a failure that only birthed more failure. In the high-stakes game of 20th century aviation, the Americans proved that the only thing more valuable than a successful design is the wisdom gained from a spectacular disaster. The shadow of the deep mountain finally retracted, leaving behind a clear sky dominated by the simplified, perfected successors of the machine Japan thought they had stolen. The technical autopsy of the G5N revealed a phenomenon that modern engineers call the imitation trap. When Nakajima's designers dismantled the DC-4E, they were mesmerized by the American electrical system, a complex network of alternating current AC that was light years ahead of the direct current DC systems used in Japanese planes. However, they didn't realize that Douglas had struggled with electrical fires and short circuits throughout 1938. By copying the system exactly, Nakajima inherited a fire trap. During test flights of the Shenzhen, the cockpit would often fill with the acrid smell of ozone and burning insulation. Because they hadn't designed the system from scratch, the Japanese mechanics had no idea how to troubleshoot these ghosts in the machine. They were essentially trying to maintain a computer they didn't know how to program. Furthermore, the weight distribution of the G5N was a constant battle against physics. Douglas had designed the original wing to be flexible, allowing it to absorb turbulence. But when the Japanese added heavy 20mm cannons in the dorsal and tail turrets, they changed the aircraft's center of gravity. This created a pendulum effect during flight. Pilots reported that once the Shenzhen started to roll or yaw, the momentum of the heavy turrets made it almost impossible to level the wings again. It was like trying to balance a sledgehammer on a needle. The very weapons meant to protect the bomber were making it unflyable. This led to the heartbreaking decision for many crews to fly into combat with no defensive guns just to keep the plane in the air, or to carry the guns and risk a structural stall. The final operational missions of the 1021st Kokutai were a grim testament to this struggle. By late 1944, the 4 surviving Shenzhen transports were the only heavy lifters left in the Japanese Navy. They were pushed to their absolute limits, often flying with double the recommended cargo weight to supply the starving garrisons on Tinian and Saipan. Pilots described the takeoffs as suicide runs, where the plane would use every inch of the runway, barely clearing the palm trees at the edge of the airfield. The deep mountain had become a beast of burden, its engines screaming in protest as it hauled the last hopes of a dying empire across an ocean that had become an American lake. Every flight was a gamble against mechanical fatigue and the ever-present shadow of American Hellcat fighters. By the time the American occupation forces reached the Nakajima plants in 1945, the story of the DC-4E had come full circle. The Americans found that the Japanese had actually tried to build a second bomber, the G8N Renzen, using what they had learned from the failure of the G5N. But it was too late. The Renzen was a better plane, but the industrial heart of Japan had already been stopped by the very B-29s that Carl Cover helped build. The Deep Mountain had served its final purpose. It had been a giant, silver distraction that consumed millions of yen and thousands of man-hours for a return of 0 bombs dropped. The Americans looked at the scrap heaps of the G5N and saw the ruins of a philosophy, the belief that you can win a war using your enemy's discarded ideas. The story of the DC-4E and its Japanese shadow, the G5N Shenzhen, finally concludes not in the air, but in the quiet archives of history and the silent streets of aviation memorials. By the time the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit completed its post-war autopsy, the truth was laid bare. The elaborate deception of the fake crash in Tokyo Bay had worked too well. It had not only hidden a failure from the Americans, but had also blinded the Japanese leadership to the fact that they were chasing a ghost. While Japan spent the war trying to fix a broken American concept, Douglas aircraft had moved so far ahead that the G5N was obsolete before it even reached its transport unit. This gap in understanding was the silent front of the war, a battle of brains that Japan lost the moment they stopped innovating and started imitating. The human cost of this technological race was equally profound. Lawrence Bell, the founder of Bell Aircraft, once remarked that no single individual in the aircraft industry had contributed more to both commercial and military aviation than Carl Cover. Cover's death in 1944 was a blow to the industry, but his influence was permanent. Today, if you visit the Long Beach Airport in California, you'll find a modest road named Cover Street. It is a quiet tribute to the man who flew the birth of modern travel and the death of a failed prototype. Across the ocean, there are no streets named after the Shinzen. The deep mountain exists only as a footnote in technical manuals, a cautionary tale taught to engineering students about the dangers of black box reverse engineering, where you see the part but not the pain that created it. As we reflect on this 5,000-word journey, the lesson remains as clear today as it was in 1945. Technology is not merely a collection of rivets, wires, and engines. It is a living embodiment of institutional wisdom. Douglas succeeded because they were allowed to fail, to learn, and to pivot. Japan failed because they tried to buy success with a checkbook and a spy network. The G5 in Shenzhen was supposed to cast a shadow across the Pacific, but instead, it was swallowed by the light of a superior philosophy. Every time a modern aircraft takes off today using tricycle landing gear, a feature first tested on that failed DC-4E, it carries a piece of this story with it. It is a reminder that in the forge of history, understanding your own work is the only true substitute for victory. If you found this deep dive into the forgotten shadows of World War II compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us continue to uncover and share these untold histories. Subscribe to stay connected with our community of history enthusiasts from Texas to Tasmania. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching.